My name is Rebekah Peterson, and I want to share a story about Africa. My parents, Vernon and Doris Swenson, were Lutheran missionaries in Africa. I was born in Tanzania, East Africa, and lived there through my 5th grade. When I met Tim, I told him about my dream to return to Tanzania. He was excited about the idea from the beginning. About 16 years ago, we began to plan and budget for a trip to Tanzania. The summer of 2009 became our target date because our children would still be at home and old enough to remember. The years passed quickly. As 2009 approached, Tim planned the crop rotation so we would have a large fall crop in 2008 and no wheat to cut in July 2009. The plane tickets to Tanzania were expensive, so we wanted a full 3 weeks in the country to make it worthwhile. There was much to do: passports, shots, malaria medicine, and emergency medical flyback plans. The main purpose of the trip was to visit the mission stations where my parents served, but all of them were in small villages in very rural areas and were not accessible by local transportation. I was unsure about how to get to these isolated locations. I knew another missionary kid living in Tanzania by the name of Thad Peterson. I went to boarding school with him, and I had heard that he and his 2 brothers ran a safari business called Dorobo Safaris. We got their email from the guidebook called The Lonely Planet. When we emailed Thad our plans, he was very helpful. He said, "I'll provide you with a driver and Land Rover." So our transportation problem was solved. When we left for Tanzania, I felt a connection with my parents, who left on a similar adventure 60 years before. My parents left Sharon Springs, Kansas by train and traveled for weeks by ship across the Atlantic, through the Mediterranean, and down the East African coast. We left our farm and drove to Lindsborg to visit my father in a nursing home, and then to Kansas City. We flew from Kansas City to Minneapolis. Then from Minneapolis, we flew all night to Copenhagen. After a couple hours in Copenhagen, we boarded a KLM plane for another 8-hour flight to Kilimanjaro International Airport. It took my parents weeks to travel to Tanzania. We did it in less than 24 hours. As we walked from the plane to the airport terminal that first night, we could smell and feel the earthy, lush air. I knew I was back home, back in Africa. Several young men helped us find a taxi and carried our luggage. We made sure to tip everyone, and then we popped into a nice older Toyota. But something was different. The driver sat on the right side. Now we really knew we were in a very different country and far from home. As we rode to Moshi, we talked with the taxi driver, who spoke very good English. Swahili is the main language, but English is also taught in the schools. Throughout the trip, I liked to practice my Swahili, but we found that the Tanzanians also liked to practice their English. However, they did appreciate our attempts to use their language. At our hotel, we settled into our rooms for a good night's sleep and made sure our mosquito nets were down, but our sleep was short. At 5 a.m., we heard the Islamic call to prayer from the nearby mosque. With this sound, we knew we were in a different country, far from home. At sunrise, the busy city of Moshi came alive with the sound of roosters and the honking of horns. After a nice breakfast, we left the hotel compound to venture into the city. The first thing we did was change some US dollars to Tanzanian shillings at a bank near the hotel. We spent the next few hours exploring Moshi. It was different to be suddenly in a third world nation. There were so many people, graceful women with colorful clothing and their loads balanced on their heads, decorated cars and buses packed full with people. That afternoon, as the clouds cleared, we had a special welcome to Tanzania when we saw the massive peak of Mount Kilimanjaro. What a sight! But a camera was missing. Oh yeah, we left it behind at the bank. When we walked into the bank, a guard immediately motioned for us to follow him into an office where he retrieved our camera from the top of a desk of a busy manager who was talking on the phone. Our Asante Sana was met with a smile and a friendly wave of the hand from the busy manager as if it was nothing. Every traveler should be a little street smart in any country, even in the U.S., but in Tanzania we never had any threat of being robbed or endangered. The next morning we finished breakfast and our driver, Mr. Mbowe, arrived promptly to begin the next part of our adventure. After packing the Land Rover, we left Moshi and traveled to Marangu. The Marangu Hotel, a classic British guest house, sits at the foot of Mount Kilimanjaro and is used as a base for climbers. After lunch, we started a 10-mile trip to Mwika on an unpaved road. It had been raining quite a bit, so it was an adventure driving. The hilly, muddy road was crowded with pedestrians and other vehicles. We quickly learned how good and safe our driver was. With Mr. Mbowe's help as our interpreter, we soon found the Mwika Bible School, which was the last place where my parents had served in Tanzania. The Tanzanian staff showed us around the grounds of the Bible School, and I saw my old house. The next morning, we loaded the Land Rover and started for Arusha. Along the way, Mr. Mbowe showed us his church and invited us to his home. We met his wife and his 90-year-old mother. How gracious they were. Then on to Arusha. Busy, busy Arusha, the safari capital of Tanzania. After shopping in Arusha for Tanzanite and other souvenirs, we went to the home of Thad Peterson, who helped us make many of the arrangements. After a nice visit with Thad and his wife, we were back to the hotel. There was a lot of excitement in the dining room from a group that had just returned from a safari. The next day was Sunday, and we worshiped at a large Lutheran church. The service was in Swahili. Every seat was filled with people dressed in their nicest clothes. There were many young people, and how the congregation sang. No organ, no hymnals. After church, we went to a lively outdoor market and a modern Western-style supermarket to get a few supplies before we began our trip to Singida, which is the major town in the area where my parents worked as missionaries. Our driver carefully drove through the busy traffic as we left Arusha. Outside of Arusha, the land looks dry and treeless, much like western Kansas. 40 years ago, I saw herds of wildlife grazing on the open plains outside of Arusha, but those days are gone. Today it is people everywhere. Just about everywhere we drove, there were people walking on the side of the road. As we turned south to go to Singida, the pavement soon ended. I was surprised to see that this road was still not paved after 40 years. This was the same road that I traveled when I would go to boarding school with other upcountry kids, but this time I was with my husband and children. 40 years ago, it was not hard to find a place for a picnic and a potty stop. The school bus would just stop along the road, and the girls would go on one side and the boys the other. There was lots of bush. Today, it is more difficult to find a place to stop because there are so many people, homes, and livestock. Eventually, we found a spot for a picnic and we wandered around and looked at the landscape, vegetation, and bugs. Our picnic stops during our trip were fun. Each time our driver would spread out a wonderful lunch on the hood of the Land Rover with cold Pepsi or Fanta to drink. It was a real treat. Soon we were back on our road. Halfway to Singida was the town of Babati. We found a hotel on Lake Babati to stay the night. We had time to relax around the lake and visit with local Tanzanians who were also enjoying the surroundings. Tim and Andrew were crazy enough to take a ride in a canoe and go see the hippos. Later that evening, we had a delicious African-style meal of chicken, ugali, and rice. The next morning was beautiful as we had breakfast alongside the lake. Soon we were in the Land Rover on our way to Singida. On the road outside of Babati, we were surprised to come across some Chinese surveyors working to build a new road. As we came closer to the Singida vicinity, we noticed the baobabs scattered here and there, but also many umbrella acacia trees, candelabra trees, and a few sausage trees. We also began to notice huge boulders scattered around or piled on hills. These rocks provided great climbing experiences for missionary kids then and for us now. As we neared Singida area, I tried to find signs of a former mission station at a village named Kitatimu, where we lived when I was 5. No luck. Kitatimu had blended into Singida. Gone was the country drive between Kitatimu and Singida, where an occasional giraffe would run across the road. Sometimes a lion or leopard be spotted at night. At Kitatimu, I remember laying in my bed at night and hearing the eerie howls of the hyenas, but no more. It is all city. We arrived in Singida. How big and bustling. Not at all like the peaceful little town my parents arrived at in 1954. We found our hotel and were once again treated with gracious hospitality. Singida is not a tourist destination. Any white people, or Wazungu as we were called, were there on business. That evening, we ate outside of the hotel restaurant on a patio. Before serving the meal, the waiter brought a pitcher of water and towels. He poured the water into a basin as we washed our hands. We were up early the next morning to find Wemberi, which was about 70 miles from Singida. My family lived at Wemberi when I was in 2nd grade. The Wemberi mission station was at the base of a 1,000-foot escarpment. To get to this isolated station back then, we would travel a primitive, narrow, rocky, and sometimes washed-out road that wound its way down the steep hill. As a child, I remember being at the top of the hill as we began our descent, and I could see our house far below. It was a relief to reach the bottom after a ride that was terrifying and thrilling at the same time. We could see a 250-foot waterfall from our house, and it was a short hike away. Baboons lived in caves by the waterfall, and we could hear them during the evening. My mom always reminded us to shake out our shoes for scorpions and to watch out for snakes around our house or near the waterfall. Today, the old road down the escarpment is not used. We took a different road and had to backtrack along the escarpment to find Wemberi. We finally found the waterfall I was looking for. As we drove closer to the waterfall, we came to an elementary school. We got out of the car and introduced ourselves. The children were so excited to see white people. Wazungu! Wazungu! Once again, we were received graciously by the staff. Mr. Mbowe told them my story in Swahili, and I showed them my picture of the house. They said it was still standing, and the principal offered to show us the way. Soon we were back to the house I remembered. We had a nice walk to the river below the waterfall. We gathered some small wimberry rocks to take home to my father and siblings. Soon we were on the road again. We left the Wimberry area and headed to Kiamboy. On the way, we stopped for a picnic lunch down by a river. While we were there, we watched as women came to the river to get water, as has been done for a very long time. We drove to Kiamboy, which is about 20 miles away, to visit my old boarding school and the hospital where I was born. Today, the hospital is a very busy place, but a young doctor took time to give us a quick tour. He had been trained in Minnesota and returned to help his home country instead of making a lot of money in the States. He said that access to clean water is a problem, and many of his patients suffered from HIV/AIDS. After the hospital visit, we went to my former boarding school called Augustana School. Augustana was the Lutheran boarding school for kids grades 1 to 8. When I went to school at Augustana, there was an average of 50 kids managed by one set of house parents. Today, the buildings are used as the Kiamboy Lutheran Bible Institute for Tanzanians to train evangelists. A faculty member showed us around. How fun it was to see my old classrooms, the outside corridor where I roller skated, remnants of the old basketball court, the church where we would worship, and Big Tree. Big Tree was a huge fig tree used as a massive jungle gym. Just imagine a game of tag played up in the branches of a tree. The next day, we got an early start to Kinapanda. We wanted to see a Tanzanian pastor who had served with my father. Unfortunately, he was away at Dodoma, but we sat down under a shade tree and had a nice visit with his wife, Mrs. Musa. She pulled out her cell phone and called her husband. I had a pleasant little chat with Pastor Musa. After our visit, we found the church. A tall, nicely dressed man emerged from the house next door. He greeted us and introduced himself as the pastor. We told him that I was baptized there 50 years ago. He showed us the church, and from the churchyard we could see the beautiful view of the long, wide valley below that my mother often described. We returned to Singida that afternoon and ventured to the local market. I was able to practice my Swahili because few people spoke English. We bought some pretty cloth and a simple basket used in the African homes. It was a lively and fun experience. The next morning we got an early start in order to return to northern Tanzania. We were soon on a narrow, rough, dusty road that led to Karatu. We had to watch out for fast-moving trucks, overloaded buses, and people walking along the side. We seemed to be the only private vehicle on the road. Along the way, near Yambi, we saw the cross on the top of a hill that my sister remembers distinctly and had asked me to watch for. At lunchtime, Mr. Mbowe found a peaceful spot right along a lake. Below us were reeds and homemade dugout canoes resting in the water. There were water birds. It was peaceful and picturesque. We arrived in Karatu that evening, and the next day began a traditional tourist circuit of game parks, Maasai warriors, and Indian Ocean beaches. However, this is a story we must save for another time. We need to close this evening with a few final thoughts. First, the biggest change that I saw in Tanzania was the huge increase in population. Today there are 4 times as many people, and almost half of them are under the age of 16. Only 4% of the land in Tanzania is suitable for farming. We must continue to raise more and more crops in Kansas to help feed the people in Tanzania and the rest of the world. We must continue to preserve our soil and natural resources so that agriculture in Kansas remains highly productive. Second, Christianity in Tanzania and much of Africa is alive and growing. In a few short years, there will be more African Christians than those who have a European heritage. Third, Tanzania, like other developing nations, is poor. The average per person income in the U.S. is $46,000. In Tanzania, it is $1,400. They do not have tax money to spend on infrastructure, and it takes money to build roads, schools, and hospitals. It takes money to provide clean water and electricity. It takes money to support conservation districts. We are fortunate that our forefathers had the ability and wisdom to invest in our great country. I hope we have the same courage to use our resources wisely. Finally, if you want to visit Africa, go to Tanzania. The country is very stable and the people are polite and friendly. There are many world-renowned attractions: Mount Kilimanjaro, the Serengeti, Ngorongoro Crater, Zanzibar Island, and Olduvai Gorge, to name a few. Your days will fill quickly with adventures, and you will leave much too soon.
Mungu ibariki Tanzania, dumisha uhuru na umoja wake kwa waume na watoto. Mungu ibariki